Where the world is heading, there is a greater pressure on all rights in all different areas: gender rights, identity rights, even economic rights. It's all kind of up for grabs constantly. So I think we should think as a society: what do we want? How are we going to live together? What's the best way of doing that? And persevere and try to create that possibility in that future.
Welcome to the Research and Reason podcast. Join us as we discuss the latest research, news, and opinion from arts academics at the University of Auckland.
Tēnā koutou katoa, ko Julianne Evans aho. I'm Julianne Evans, the Media Advisor for the Faculty of Arts, and my guest today is Chris Ogden, an Associate Professor in the School of Cultures, Languages and Linguistics, and the new Director of Global Studies in the faculty. His areas of focus include the dynamics of power and identity, especially in relation to Asia and more specifically China and India. Tēnā koe, Chris. Great to have you here.
Thanks for having me.
You're a fairly new resident to this country, aren't you?
Coming up to a year on Friday.
Yeah.
Yeah.
A year. And you're from the UK originally?
Originally from England, spent a long time living in Scotland. I lived at other places. Lived in Japan for a while, lived in Nepal for a while. Yeah.
Great. What brought you here?
Challenge and change. Definitely better weather. I'm amazed that this is the beginning of spring. This is like a best Scottish day ever in the summer. And difference, I think, really. Different perspective, different way of doing things, different ways of understanding. So it's definitely been stimulating.
Yeah. And did you have any idea about, for example, Māori culture before you came or anything like that?
We'd come as a family before we had children in 2010. So I definitely had an understanding or an idea. My understanding is still growing, but I'm definitely very appreciative of being in a multicultural environment. Yeah. And one that celebrates it and one that's not really in denial, as some other places are.
It's really great too, isn't it, when you come from a global studies background to sort of look at how different countries navigate those sorts of things, those Indigenous things. Yeah,
I think so, and also it's the celebration side. So I've already noticed here with students that they're able to much more tell their story about who they are and where they've come from. Where I did come from, it was normally in quite a flat way. I'm just from this place, but students here will say, "Well, I came at this time. My parents came and they did these things." There's a kind of a narrative.
It's interesting, isn't it?
Yeah, much greater awareness about who they are and where it's going. And I think that's very positive.
Yeah. Now, when I was preparing for this interview, I was spoilt for choice because you have published very widely in the area of political science. But the one that I settled on, the most recent book, I think, of yours, has rather a dramatic title, The Authoritarian Century, China's Rise and the Demise of the Liberal International Order, published by Bristol University Press in 2022. Was that, on purpose, quite an eye-catching title?
A little bit, but it's also kind of based upon what's happened in different phases of history. So we can talk about an American century. Before that, we can talk about a British century. As part of the American century, we would talk about a Pax Democratica, kind of a democratic peace, how, say, domestic values in the United States have been pushed out into the system, and that made for a more democratically minded system, different institutions, different understandings. And the premise there would be if China's rising to prominence, which it is, if it has the world's largest economy, which it does on some measures, if it has a very large military, and if it's making institutions, then its domestic values should also be injected into the system, and that would make some kind of Pax Autocratica, authoritarian century in some form.
Do you feel like that's a trend that it's turning the tide a bit? It's on the rise. It's happening around the world in other places as well.
I think there's definitely increased instances of authoritarianism, definitely over the last decade. On some measures, it's estimated that maybe only 7% of all countries have a fully fledged democratic system. So this means where there's full political polarity. So there are distinct opposition groups, for example. There are clear nationwide votes with universal suffrage. There's clear rule of law where law is separate. It's a kind of check and balance on power rather than kind of rule by law, which would mean the government basically just uses the judiciary as an extension of power. and also where there's a fully functioning civil society, where individuals can be activists, they can agitate for change in particular ways. So, yeah, it seems as though there's a big decline, there's a democratic recession, and lots of countries are becoming, they can still be called democracies, but are showing authoritarian tendencies. And the context there was the pandemic, in terms of seeing how countries could react in very autocratic ways if they wanted to, but also being in Britain where there was a definitive kind of backsliding in terms of democracy.
Do you think that COVID's changed the whole nature of things? Do you mean? You meant in terms of how the pandemic was managed by different countries?
I think it's more in the sense of the pandemic was a situation that revealed that a country can behave, and most countries can behave in a highly autocratic manner if they want to.
Including our own, including New Zealand.
Including our own,
Yeah.
everywhere. Yeah, absolutely. All countries were capable of locking down. They were capable of restricting movement, restricting association, restricting particular rights that we took for granted. And the situation demanded it, but also in virtually all countries there's legislation that says this is acceptable. If certain criteria are met, we can invoke these certain understandings of how the government deals with its population. So I think it was more a kind of pulling back of a curtain, really, more than anything else. China was obviously the kind of leading figure there. And this book actually started by, I wrote a letter to The Guardian. I tried for years and years and years to get a letter in The Guardian.
And you finally succeeded.
And I finally succeeded with a letter that said, look at China. Look how they've been able to lock down so quickly. They've shut down cities. They've shut down all travel. They've shut down communication, which was actually quite useful at some stages in the pandemic because there was so much misinformation going around. And I think I read it in February of 2020. And the end line said, given that in the UK we just had kind of serial incompetence, where the leaders were in denial, they'd be like, well, it's in Italy. When's it going to get here? Without obviously understanding we live in a massively globalized world, where clearly it was already within the country. And at the end of this letter, I said, maybe we'll all wish that we lived in China for a while, because they had a handle on what was going on.
And they were doing a good job of managing it.
At that time, yeah, they appeared that they were doing a very good job of managing it. So I was successful in publishing that letter.
Did you get a lot of response?
The next day I appeared on Radio 4, BBC Radio 4, where they had a programme called PM, which is their big news programme. It started with Boris Johnson, Prime Minister, then the Health Secretary, Matt Hancock, and then there was me. And it was like, do you think we need to have a conversation about how we're going to deal with the pandemic when it comes? And I was like, absolutely we do. We need to think about what we're going to have to give up as individuals in order for the kind of collective health to prevail. And that was really the starting point. And then combined with the fact that we were locked down, I was living in Edinburgh, we were locked down, I had a very small room to work in, like about half the size of this room.
And nothing else to do.
And I had children to look after, I had a frontline health worker, like a partner to support. But I think just in that mood of suddenly thinking, oh, look, this is maybe what it feels like a little bit. And that was definitely a big spur, beyond thinking about China's rise, thinking about world order, all these kind of concepts.
Yeah. And then that took you to thinking about what the characteristics of an authoritarian regime are, and how that could slowly infiltrate, I suppose, other countries' ways of doing things to the point where we think it's just normal to do things like that. Was that your progression?
Yeah, I think so. I think one big thing I found in the literature was that often a lot of writers think there's a kind of dyad. Like, either you're a democracy or you're an autocracy. And I try to think, well, maybe you can be on a spectrum. So you could be democratic, but you slowly shift to becoming authoritarian. You know, say Britain, for example, you can still vote in a fair election. There is universal suffrage. But in other ways, there are definitely authoritarian tendencies. So, for example, it is possible in Britain now to be arrested on your way to a protest. If you're found in a car with placards or loudhailers, that's considered to be illegal. That's highly authoritarian.
Yeah.
So there's that kind of sliding or a kind of merging of those senses together. In the Chinese context, in the 1960s, we would say that China was highly totalitarian, And actually they liberalised a bit and they became more authoritarian. Actually in China you can vote in elections. There are village elections, not at the other levels, but there are. So they're also a combination. So trying to understand that kind of, that blending, as it were, and trying to also hold democracy to the highest standards, to try and say, if in any way there are autocratic tendencies, that means that the country is authoritarian. Rather than what often happens is a lot of analysts say, well, overall it's democratic, right? Or we still have these rights, but I'm more interested in about rights being constrained and the rights always being kind of negotiated. And this is something that I saw in China, but actually in plenty of other countries. And I think that that's probably the biggest thing in that project, really, is that actually I would say the authoritarian centre will come about not because of China, it will come about because of the other big powers. So I think it's very unlikely that a Chinese leader will stand up in the way an American leader would stand up and say, we want the world to be democratic. I don't think any Chinese leader is ever going to stand up and say, let's all be autocratic. But I do think that the attitudes or the values of the really big countries determine how everybody else acts. There's a kind of assimilation or normalization. So I would say it's not just China being authoritarian, which it definitely is. There's a lack of political polarity. Not everybody can vote all at the same time. It's more rule by law rather than rule of law, so it's an extension of political power, so on and so forth. But this backsliding that's happening in the United States, certainly under the previous president, but if you ever look at other big powers, Russia, Germany, look at India under Modi, which is also showing these kind of impulses or tendencies, that will shift the order towards something more autocratic.
Are there ways of resisting that?
I think, first of all...
Should we resist that?
A lot of conversations have come up in the context of this book where I've said to people, yeah, but look, your rights are being restricted to protesting. And someone will say, yeah, but I don't want to protest. I was like, no, but what you need to think about is, think about the day in the future when you do want to protest and you find out that you can't. So sure, we don't all want to protest about the same things. We don't care all about the same things.
But we want the right to choose.
We want the right to choose, and have that possibility, right? The ability to express ourselves when we want to. So I think first of all is to recognise that rights need to be tended and looked after. But beyond that, to also recognise that democracy itself is not some universal thing that is just here, it's just innate. It's been fought for and it needs to be maintained. And in actual fact, without sounding really negative, but in the fullness of time, democracy is just a blip, really, in our history. And it can easily just blip away and evaporate. So I think heightened levels of education, in this country, in all countries, you just should understand, why do we have a weekend? For a long time, people didn't have a weekend.
Or a 40-hour week.
Exactly. Or, access to health, access to education. These are all things that people have fought for, which we consider to be important, but often we just don't understand the background. So I think people should be better educated. I think at the end of the book, I actually say it should be mandatory. It should be mandatory for governments to have public information campaigns. There should be programs, say in the New Zealand context of, how did the vote come about? Why? How did unions come about and why? How did all these votes that we think, all these rights that we think we've got, how did they come about? Then if we understand them better, then we can be more aware about when they're being threatened in particular ways.
And how much they matter. Even things like thinking of feminism, for example. I've heard quite a few women say, well, I'm not a feminist or I don't need to be a feminist. And that's really the same thing, isn't it? I mean, not very long ago, and in fact even now, in a lot of these countries, including, I imagine, India, particularly, women are still struggling. Women don't have the rights that other people have. So,
yeah, absolutely.
Why we think we can sit back and not worry, I'm not sure. But
none of it is innate, and also that's something I've realised in my research is that often the West will talk about universal human rights. There aren't universal human rights.
No, not now.
Our rights are very individualistic. Rights in the Asian context in China and India are much more collective. So that suggests that there can be difference. It also suggests they're contested. But equally, look at lots of different things. Rights kind of succeed for a long time, but they get pushed back by particular groups. And really, they're all just norms and values. that if leaders come about who are willing to not act by convention, they can break those rules and values. And we're seeing that all over the place. We saw it hugely in Britain with Boris Johnson, where commentators would say, oh, but you don't do that. And he just sat there
He just went and did it.
Well, I'm just going to do it. You know, the same with a figure such as Trump, Bolsonaro, Putin, any of them. If you have the power and you hold it, you can change the world in whichever way. And I think that sounds very scary. But I would also say we have the ability to change the world in whichever way we want to change the world. It's just constructed. It's just made upon particular lines. And certainly, where the world is heading, there is a greater pressure on all rights in all different areas: gender rights, identity rights, even economic rights. It's all kind of up for grabs constantly. So I think we should think as a society: what do we want? How are we going to live together? What's the best way of doing that? And persevere and try to create that possibility in that future, I would say.
Yeah, I mean, I think, there would be people who'd argue that democracy is not perfect as it is either. You know, like think of democracy in America, where really it's about money to some degree, isn't it? Which candidates can get the biggest campaign war chest and stand. I mean, there are people who would like to change the way we look at democracy as well.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. There's a quote from Churchill, I think, where he says, like, democracy is the best of a bad bunch of political systems, which is valid.
But it probably beats a few others.
I would say it beats a lot of other systems. Think about people living under military juntas, for example, or where people are under constant surveillance. Or I think there's loads of other systems which would be very negative. In terms of dealing with.
I would agree. Because the other area that you look at, I don't know if you do in this book, is India, isn't it?
Yeah.
Do you discuss India?
I discuss India as one of the kind of great powers, kind of what's happening there filters down, yeah.
And you've made a particular study of Modi and his rise and his continued dominance. Do you see that continuing?
I mean, he won the last election. I still think there's a good possibility he'll win the next election for lots of different reasons. I mean, he has a kind of cult effect upon the Indian population, but he's also bringing India to huge international prominence. He's able to kind of dig into historical grievances in the same way that happens in China, that India's status was somehow diminished. He's pulling that back. India is now a hugely influential world force, but also people are richer with India. So I think he's successful on all those levels. But the big subtext is that he's in a Hindu nationalist party that really wants to assimilate all other identities within that identity. And that itself is autocratic because it's denying plurality. There'll still be elections, but as you mentioned before, there's also a lot of money in Indian elections, almost reaching kind of American levels.
Gosh.
Which suggests in its current form that it might become more autocratic. And we could have said before, actually, by the way, that all these systems can change. So one big debate in the UK, for example, is that there's two houses. There's the House of Commons and the House of Lords. Legislation gets voted in the House of Commons and then gets voted again for in the House of Lords. And an argument there is often, well, you need both houses because you need a kind of check and a balance. And if you don't, the country won't effectively work. Now, in New Zealand, there used to be two houses.
And now there's not.
And now there's not. The top one was abolished. New Zealand's still functioning. So all countries can kind of have their traits or the ways that they do things. But again, they can be. I think it's often about courage, suggesting that there can be a better way of doing things. The United States, they could put in caps on all the funding for the elections if they wanted to.
But they don't want to.
Well, they don't want to.
No.
But it's also about entrenched power. And one other thing in that book is about, it's not just political power, but even economically, there's a kind of authoritarianism because we live in a highly neoliberal world where there aren't other ways of doing things. And that itself is autocratic. A lot of tech companies are highly autocratic. They buy up competitors. They don't want alternatives. They want monopolies. Again, that's saying there can only be one way. There's no plurality.
They use a lot of cheap labour from those countries, don't they?
Yeah, exactly. It's all kind of feeding in particular ways. But I don't think it's beyond us as individuals and groups of individuals to say we'd like things to work in this way, a more representative way. And I think we can be empowered in those ways.
I'm just wondering what else links these things together, the old order, the new order, the things we've been talking about. Is there another factor that we haven't discussed?
So one big thing, I think, was technology. Use of technology kind of on a day-to-day basis, but how it can be used by regimes. So a lot of listeners maybe have heard about the social credit system in China, which gives individuals a kind of social score in terms of if they're a good citizen. So if they should show loyalty to the state, if they adhere to kind of communist values, they get a higher ranking, and that ranking allows them to do particular things. So it gives them access to maybe education, access to a mortgage. At the lower end, it will give them access to travel. So if you have a very low score, you won't be allowed to buy train tickets, plane tickets, this kind of a thing.
Gosh, I didn't know that.
Yeah, it's quite shocking. And is used as a form of social control. So there are instances in squares in China where it will put up the picture of somebody and say they've got a low credit rating as a kind of fear device amongst the population.
And a shame device
And
as
a shaming
well.
device, yeah, absolutely. Now, this is obviously very shocking. But those similar, that kind of algorithmic kind of authoritarianism, to some degree is present within our societies. So if I want to get a mortgage, I need a high credit rating. If I don't have the high credit rating, I won't be allowed to do that. There are many universities, I'm not sure about this university, but there are definitely ones in the United States who use similar algorithms to determine whether you have the entry criteria or whether you're eligible for particular things. If I've crashed a car repeatedly, it will be harder for me to get car insurance. And much of this is done with algorithms, like beyond a personal level. So that's happening in lots of different ways. And equally, China's often also criticised for being a highly surveilling state, but we also live in a very highly surveilled state. Not much has changed since Edward Snowden's revelations about how information is collected, how it's shared, particularly amongst the Five Eyes, which includes New Zealand. And everything on our phones, pretty much everything we've done, is collated and viewed and analysed, and we can be put on particular lists for particular things we do or say. And on a fundamental level, there's not much difference. There's a degree of difference, for sure. My face isn't up on a screen saying I'm a bad citizen, but I think the fundamentals are still there, and I think that is something for us to really consider. And one of the conclusions I have in the book is to say, you know, maybe there's a kind of global panopticon kind of future where it's just tech companies above the state level who are kind of saying what we can do and what we can't do.
That doesn't seem too outrageous to me, actually. I mean, it sounds horrible, but it doesn't sound unlikely.
Well, we've all got surveillance devices. Like this is a surveillance device, saying where I am, what I'm doing. It's taking stuff. I can talk to it. You know, if I say Siri or Alexa or whatever, it's listening and it will be activated.
Yeah, when it listens, that's weird, isn't it?
Yeah.
And then it gives you an ad based on something you're talking about.
Yeah, exactly.
A lot of us are not really aware of this stuff, but it's happening.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Or you have a Gmail account and you're typing, the adverts change relative to what you're typing. It's all there, right?
Yeah.
So I think, you know, it's scary to be thinking about authoritarianism, but it's also useful to think about these linkages. And there's a kind of complicity in a weird sense, you know. If we think that's okay here, then that's letting it happen to a bigger degree somewhere else.
Yeah. So for more on all of this, I imagine that global studies is probably somewhere that a student, could find out more and engage with some of these big ideas.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, all of these are things that we would cover. And the biggest thing we think about is just an awareness. A mindset about who we are as individuals, but also how we can be proactive to help change the world in a better way. So these are all certainly things that will be covered and more. Yeah.
Very good. Lovely to talk to you, Chris. Thank you so much for coming in. Ngā mihi nui.
Thank you very much for having me. It's a pleasure.
You've been listening to the Research and Reason podcast. Stay up to date with the Faculty of Arts by following us on social media.